Ambassador told Alain Delon, "You don't belong here." What happened next changed diplomacy. This is the incredible true story of how one moment of diplomatic arrogance and cultural dismissiveness at one of the most important international gatherings of the 1970s led to a complete transformation in how European cultural diplomacy was conducted, proving that sometimes the most powerful ambassadors are not those who hold official titles, but those who embody the very culture and values they represent, and that authentic cultural authority can accomplish more in a single conversation than years of traditional diplomatic protocols. September 8, 1976. The Élysée Palace in Paris was hosting one of the most significant international cultural summits in recent history. Representatives from 37 nations had gathered for the inaugural European Cultural Integration Conference, a groundbreaking diplomatic initiative designed to strengthen cultural ties between European countries and establish new frameworks for international artistic and educational exchange. The summit was the culmination of 2 years of careful diplomatic preparation, involving foreign ministers, cultural attachés, and educational administrators from across Europe. The goal was to create lasting institutions that would promote cultural understanding and artistic collaboration between nations that had spent centuries in conflict with each other. The Élysée Palace setting was chosen specifically to emphasize the cultural sophistication and intellectual heritage that European civilization could offer to the world. The ornate reception halls, filled with centuries of French artistic achievement, provided a backdrop that reminded delegates of the cultural treasures that international cooperation was designed to protect and promote. Leading the French delegation was Ambassador Claude Moreau, a career diplomat whose 30-year progression through the foreign ministry had been built on a deep understanding of traditional diplomatic protocol and an unwavering commitment to maintaining the formal structures that governed international relations. Ambassador Moreau was widely respected for his negotiating skills and his ability to navigate complex political situations with precision and authority. However, Ambassador Moreau's approach to diplomacy was fundamentally traditional, emphasizing official credentials, institutional authority, and carefully maintained hierarchical relationships between government representatives. In his view, effective diplomacy required clear distinctions between official participants and external observers, and he was vigilant about maintaining these boundaries during important international gatherings. Among the invited guests was 40-year-old Alain Delon, whose presence at the summit was part of a broader initiative to include prominent cultural figures in discussions about international artistic exchange. The organizers believed that having respected artists participate in the conference would demonstrate the practical importance of the cultural cooperation they were trying to establish. Alain had been invited specifically because his international career had made him a unique symbol of European cultural achievement that transcended national boundaries. His films had been successful throughout Europe and internationally, making him an ideal representative of the kind of cultural bridge building that the conference was designed to promote. But Alain's invitation had been issued through cultural ministry channels rather than traditional diplomatic protocols, a distinction that would prove significant when Ambassador Moreau encountered him at the summit's opening reception. The evening reception was designed as an opportunity for delegates to meet informally before the formal sessions began. The gathering was held in the palace's magnificent Salon des Ambassadeurs, where representatives from across Europe mingled in an atmosphere that combined diplomatic formality with cultural sophistication.
Alain arrived at the reception dressed in his characteristic understated elegance, a perfectly tailored dark suit that spoke of quality without ostentation, presenting himself as a serious cultural representative rather than a celebrity seeking attention. His approach to the evening was professional and respectful, understanding that his role was to contribute to important discussions about European cultural cooperation rather than to promote his own career or seek personal recognition. But when Ambassador Moreau noticed Alain at the reception, he saw not a legitimate participant in international cultural diplomacy, but an entertainment figure who had somehow gained inappropriate access to a serious governmental gathering. From Ambassador Moreau's perspective, the presence of actors and entertainers at diplomatic functions represented a troubling trend toward the popularization of international relations. He believed that effective diplomacy required expertise, training, and official authority that could not be substituted by celebrity status or public recognition. Approaching Alain with the kind of authoritative manner that had served him well in countless diplomatic situations, Ambassador Moreau made a decision that would create one of the most significant cultural diplomatic incidents of the decade. "Excuse me," Ambassador Moreau said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone exercising official authority, "but I believe there has been some confusion. This is a restricted gathering for accredited diplomatic representatives and government cultural officials. You don't belong here." The comment was not just a matter of protocol enforcement, it was a fundamental assertion about who had the right to participate in discussions about European cultural cooperation. Ambassador Moreau was declaring that cultural diplomacy was the exclusive province of government officials and that artists themselves had no role in shaping the policies that would affect how artists work, how audiences experience art, and how cultural understanding develops between peoples. The reaction from other reception attendees was immediate and uncomfortable. Several cultural ministers and educational administrators who had specifically requested Alain's participation looked shocked that their invited guest was being challenged in such a public and dismissive manner. Alain's response to Ambassador Moreau's assertion would transform not just the immediate situation, but the entire approach to cultural diplomacy that the conference was designed to establish. Rather than responding with indignation or attempting to assert his right to be present based on his invitation, Alain chose a completely different approach that demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural sophistication that the conference was meant to promote. "Ambassador Moreau," Alain replied, his voice calm and respectful, "I appreciate your attention to protocol, and I understand your concern about maintaining appropriate boundaries during important diplomatic discussions." The response was unexpected in its graciousness and professionalism, immediately establishing that Alain was not seeking confrontation, but genuine dialogue about the issues that had brought them together. "However," Alain continued, "I think this situation provides an excellent opportunity to discuss exactly what we mean when we talk about cultural diplomacy and who should be involved in creating policies that will affect how European artists and audiences connect with each other across national boundaries." He gestured slightly toward the other reception attendees, many of whom had stopped their own conversations to observe what was developing between the ambassador and the actor. "The ministers and administrators here tonight are experts in policy development and international cooperation. Their skills and knowledge are essential for creating the institutional frameworks that will make cultural exchange possible and effective." But then Alain made the observation that would fundamentally change how everyone present understood the relationship between official diplomacy and cultural representation. "But perhaps," he said, looking directly at Ambassador Moreau with respectful but unwavering attention, "cultural diplomacy also requires the participation of those who actually create and share the culture that we're discussing. The policies you develop will affect how artists work, how audiences experience art, and how cultural understanding develops between peoples."
The logic was simple but profound. How could meaningful policies about cultural exchange be created without input from the people who would actually be responsible for creating and sharing that culture? I'm here tonight not as an entertainer seeking recognition, but as someone whose career has been built on exactly the kind of international cultural cooperation that this conference is designed to promote. My films have been seen by audiences throughout Europe and internationally, creating connections and understanding between people who speak different languages and come from different traditions. Elaine's explanation was transforming the conversation from a protocol dispute into a substantive discussion about the nature and purpose of cultural diplomacy. Rather than defending his right to be present, he was articulating a vision of how cultural cooperation could work most effectively. If we believe that culture can build bridges between nations and create understanding between peoples, then perhaps the people who create that culture should be part of the conversations about how to support and promote their work. The reception had essentially stopped as other attendees gathered to listen to what was becoming an impromptu seminar on the relationship between cultural creation and diplomatic policy. Ambassador Moreau found himself in the position of having to respond not just to a protocol challenge, but to a sophisticated argument about the fundamental purposes of the conference he was attending. But Alain was not finished articulating his perspective on cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. The goal of this conference, he continued, is to create lasting institutions that will promote cultural understanding between European nations. That's a goal I share completely, because my entire career has been dedicated to creating work that transcends national boundaries and speaks to universal human experiences. He paused to acknowledge the other cultural figures who were present at the reception. All of us who work in international cultural fields have learned through experience what kinds of cooperation work effectively and what kinds of barriers prevent meaningful artistic exchange. We understand the practical challenges that artists face when they try to share their work across borders, and we know what kinds of support would make the biggest difference in promoting genuine cultural understanding. The argument was becoming increasingly compelling to the assembled diplomatic representatives, many of whom were beginning to recognize that their policy discussions might be significantly enhanced by input from people who had practical experience with international cultural work. Ambassador Moreau, Alain concluded, I'm not here to challenge diplomatic protocol or to seek recognition for myself. I'm here because I believe that cultural diplomacy will be most effective when it includes the voices of those who actually create the culture we're trying to promote. The reception was so thoughtful, so respectful, and so substantively relevant to the conference's goals that Ambassador Moreau found himself facing a fundamental reconsideration of his assumptions about who should participate in cultural diplomatic discussions. The immediate impact was striking. Instead of continuing to challenge Elaine's presence, Ambassador Moreau began asking questions about his experience with international cultural cooperation and the practical barriers that artists encountered when working across national boundaries. What followed was a 40-minute conversation that included not just Ambassador Moreau and Alain, but virtually every other reception attendee, as the discussion expanded into a comprehensive exploration of how cultural diplomacy could be made more effective through the inclusion of practitioners alongside policymakers. The conversation covered specific examples of successful international artistic collaborations, detailed analysis of regulatory barriers that prevented cultural exchange, and innovative proposals for new institutional structures that could support both official diplomatic goals and practical artistic needs. By the end of the reception, the entire planned format for the conference had been transformed. Instead of proceeding with purely governmental discussions about cultural policy, the organizers decided to restructure the sessions to include meaningful participation from artists, educators, and cultural practitioners who could provide practical input about the policies being developed. Elaine's impromptu explanation of why artists should be included in cultural diplomatic discussions became the foundation for a new approach to international cultural cooperation that emphasized collaboration between official diplomats and cultural practitioners. The cultural diplomacy integration model that emerged from the 1976 conference became a template for international cultural cooperation that was adopted by cultural organizations and diplomatic services throughout Europe and internationally.
Ambassador Moreau later credited his conversation with Alain as a transformative moment in his own understanding of diplomacy and international cooperation. He became one of the most effective advocates for inclusive cultural diplomacy and helped establish new protocols that ensured meaningful participation from cultural practitioners in policy development. For international relations more broadly, the incident demonstrated how diplomatic effectiveness could be enhanced when official protocols were balanced with substantive expertise from practitioners in the fields being discussed. The Élysée Palace model of cultural diplomacy, which emphasized collaboration between government representatives and cultural practitioners, influenced how international cultural cooperation was conducted for decades, establishing new standards for inclusive policy development that recognize the expertise of those who actually created and shared the culture that diplomacy was designed to promote. Most importantly, the incident proved that sometimes the most effective diplomacy occurs not through formal protocols and institutional authority, but through authentic dialogue between people who share common goals and are willing to listen to perspectives that might challenge their assumptions about how international cooperation should work. If this incredible story of cultural diplomacy transformation has inspired you, make sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to understand that effective international cooperation requires including the voices of those who actually do the work that policies are designed to support. Tell us in the comments about times when you've seen outsider perspectives transform how institutions approach their goals, because sometimes the most important innovations in diplomacy and policy come from those who understand the practical realities that official protocols are meant to address. The long-term impact of what became known as the Élysée Transformation extended far beyond the immediate changes to the 1976 Cultural Summit. Within months of the conference, diplomatic services throughout Europe began implementing new protocols that required meaningful consultation with practitioners in any field where international policy was being developed. The French Foreign Ministry, led by Ambassador Moreau's enthusiastic advocacy, established the world's first Cultural Practitioner Advisory Council, which provided formal mechanisms for artists, educators, and cultural workers to contribute to policy development that would affect their fields. This innovation was quickly adopted by other European governments who recognized that their cultural diplomacy efforts had been significantly limited by the exclusion of practical expertise. Educational institutions also embraced the Élysée model by creating new programs that combined diplomatic training with practical experience in the fields that diplomats would be responsible for governing. Future cultural attachés were required to spend time working directly with artists and cultural organizations to understand the practical implications of the policies they would be implementing. The transformation influenced international business diplomacy as well, as governments began recognizing that trade and economic policies could be more effective when they included input from the business practitioners and industry professionals who would be affected by new regulations and agreements. The incident established new standards for how conferences and summits were structured, with event organizers learning to balance official expertise with practical knowledge from the fields being discussed. The inclusive participation model became a standard approach for international gatherings that aimed to create meaningful rather than merely ceremonial outcomes. For Alain personally, the event established him as a respected voice in cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. He was subsequently invited to serve on numerous international cultural committees and became a regular consultant for governments developing policies related to artistic exchange and cultural cooperation. Perhaps most significantly, the "you don't belong here" moment became a case study used in diplomatic training programs as an example of how assumptions about authority and expertise could limit the effectiveness of international cooperation. Diplomatic trainees learned to recognize when their formal protocols might be preventing them from accessing the practical knowledge needed to create effective policies. The transformation also influenced how cultural institutions approached international cooperation, with museums, theaters, and educational organizations establishing new programs that emphasized collaboration between official institutional representatives and the artists, educators, and cultural workers who would be responsible for implementing cooperative initiatives. The incident demonstrated that sometimes the most important diplomatic innovations come not from formal negotiations between governments, but from authentic dialogue between people who share common goals and are willing to challenge assumptions about who has the right to participate in shaping the policies that will affect their work and their communities.